The first morning Kate Atwood noticed him, the sun had barely cracked the ridge line, and she was already on her knees in the dirt, fighting to coax water from a pump handle that had decided life was no longer worth living. She heard the horse before she saw the rider, the steady four-beat rhythm of hooves against the hard-packed trail that ran along the eastern fence line of her property, and when she looked up, squinting through the early amber light, she saw a man on a dark bay horse moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had all the time in the world and knew exactly where he was going. He did not look at her. He did not slow. He simply rode past, straight-backed and broad-shouldered, the brim of a weather-worn hat pulled low enough that she could not make out his face, and within 30 seconds he had disappeared around the bend where the cottonwood trees crowded the trail and swallowed everything that passed beneath them. Kate sat back on her heels and watched the dust settle where he had been. She did not think much of it that first morning. Men rode that trail all the time, though admittedly not always at such an early hour. She went back to wrestling with the pump handle, eventually succeeded in drawing a full bucket, and spent the next 11 hours doing the kind of work that filled every day of her life in the autumn of 1878 in Colby County, Texas. She fed the chickens. She mucked the small barn where her 2 remaining horses lived. She repaired a section of fence that her neighbor's wandering cattle had pushed through for the 3rd time in a month. She baked bread. She mended a split seam in her winter coat. She wrote 3 entries in the ledger that tracked every penny coming in and every penny going out of the Atwood farm, and by the time the sun dropped behind the western hills, she was too tired to think about anything except the mattress that waited for her inside the small stone house her late husband Thomas had built with his own hands 4 years ago. Thomas had been dead for 14 months. He had gone out one February morning to check on the cattle during a blue norther, and the storm had worsened faster than anyone in the county had anticipated, and they had found him 3 days later when the weather broke, frozen hard as the ground itself, his body curled against the base of an old live oak as if he had simply decided to rest there. He was 29 years old. Kate had been 26. They had been married for 2 years and there were no children, which was both a grief and a mercy she had not yet finished sorting out. The farm was legally hers. Thomas had made sure of that before he ever brought her out from Missouri, having a lawyer in the county seat draw up papers that would protect her in the event of his death, because Thomas Atwood had been a practical man who loved his wife with a thoroughness that included thinking about the worst possibilities. What he had not been able to protect her from was the relentless arithmetic of running 340 acres alone, with only seasonal help she could barely afford, in a county where a woman holding land by herself was considered either an oddity or an opportunity, depending on who was looking. She was 27 years old now, and she had survived 14 months of that arithmetic, and she intended to survive the next 14 and the 14 after that. The man on the dark bay horse came past the 2nd morning at almost exactly the same time, and the 3rd morning, and the 4th. By the 5th morning, Kate found herself at the fence line when she heard him coming, and she realized with a small jolt of self-awareness that she had arranged to be there, which was embarrassing enough that she immediately turned her back to the trail and pretended to examine the fence post she was supposedly checking. She heard the horse slow just barely, and her heart did something complicated, but when she turned around he was already past, riding at his usual steady pace, and she could not tell if the slowing had been real or imagined. She did not know who he was. That bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Colby County was not a large county, and while she did not know everyone in it, she knew most of the families who ran cattle in this part of the territory, and this man's horse and tack suggested someone who worked with cattle for a living. The saddle was good leather, well-oiled, not fancy but solid and expensive in the way that working equipment becomes expensive when it is made to last. The horse was well-bred, well-fed, and moved with the easy athleticism of an animal that was ridden regularly and cared for properly. She asked her neighbor Willa Foss about him on a Thursday afternoon when Willa came by with a basket of preserved peaches and the kind of company that Kate had been quietly desperate for without admitting it to herself. Willa Foss was 53 years old, had lived in Colby County longer than the county had an official name, and knew the business of everyone within 40 miles the way a librarian knows the contents of every book on the shelves. She was small and sharp-eyed and had a laugh that could startle roosters, and Kate loved her. "A man on a dark bay horse," Willa repeated, setting down her tea and giving the question the serious consideration it deserved. "Rides the East Trail early morning heading south. Every day," Kate said, "or at least every day that I have noticed, which is 5 days running now." Willa's sharp eyes went thoughtful. "That could be one of the Merritt hands from the Broken M. They run their cattle on the south pastures, and they have boys who ride the fence line early." "Which Broken M land starts about 3 miles south of your place?" "The Broken M," Kate said, turning the name over. She knew of the ranch the way she knew of most things in the county, by general reputation and a few specific facts. It was a larger operation, well established, run by a family that had been in the county since before the war. Good reputation. No trouble she had ever heard about. "Could be one of the Merritt boys themselves," Willa added, with a particular lightness in her voice that Kate recognized as the sound of information being offered with an expectation of reaction. "I am not interested," Kate said. "I did not say anything," Willa replied pleasantly. "You were thinking it very loudly." Willa smiled and refilled her own tea, so the man might be a Merritt. Kate filed that away and told herself it did not matter, and the next morning she was at the fence line again, and he rode past again, and this time she was certain the horse slowed, because the rhythm of hooves changed from the easy ground-eating walk to something more deliberate and careful, and it lasted for perhaps 20 feet, and then it resumed its regular pace, and the man and his horse disappeared around the cottonwood bend. Kate stood at the fence and felt something she had not felt in 14 months, something she did not have a precise name for except to say that it was warm and slightly inconvenient. She went inside and made breakfast and ate it standing at the kitchen window looking at the trail. The weeks passed in the way that weeks do when every day is fully occupied with work that will not wait. October moved through Colby County with the particular golden restlessness of Texas autumn, the leaves on the cottonwoods going yellow and dropping in slow spirals, the mornings growing sharper, the evenings coming earlier. Kate worked her land and managed her ledgers and visited Willa when she could, and attended church on Sunday mornings in the small clapboard building at the edge of town, and every morning she heard the horse on the trail. She began to notice details. He always wore the same hat, or one very like it, dark felt with a creased crown and a brim that curled at the sides from long wearing. He rode with his hands low on the reins, the way experienced riders do when they have long since stopped thinking consciously about balance. He sat tall but not rigid. Once in the 3rd week, she caught a glimpse of his face when the morning light hit at an angle she had not encountered before, and she saw a jaw with a few days of dark growth on it, and the beginning of a strong nose, and nothing else before the angle changed and he was past. She thought about him more than was reasonable. She was aware that she was thinking about him more than was reasonable. She told herself that this was simply because human company was something she craved in the isolated rhythm of her days, and any human presence, even a distant one, would naturally attract disproportionate attention. This explanation satisfied her during the daylight hours, and less so at night when the farm was quiet and the wind came through the cracks in the window frame and she lay in the dark and thought about a man she did not know. In the 4th week, a problem arrived that made the unknown rider temporarily irrelevant. His name was Garrett Lynch, and he came on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 men she did not recognize, and the particular manner of someone who has decided that politeness is a form of theater he is willing to perform for a limited engagement. He was the agent for the Colby County Land Trust, which was a name that sounded official, but was in practice a mechanism by which certain men of property acquired additional property from those who were unable or unwilling to hold it. He sat on a horse in front of her house and told her with practiced sympathy that her neighbor to the east, one Gerald Prout, had sold his 400 acres to the land trust, and that the trust was now her neighbor to the east, and that the trust was always interested in expanding its holdings where circumstances made such expansion logical. Kate stood on her porch and looked at him and waited. "Mrs. Atwood," he said, "a woman alone, managing this acreage, heading into winter. We are prepared to offer you a fair price." "I have not asked for a price," Kate said. "$320 for the full holding," he said, as if she had not spoken. Kate did some quick arithmetic. The farm, even in its current reduced state, with the herd sold down to almost nothing after Thomas's death, with the equipment aging and some of the fencing needing replacement, was worth at minimum $800, and likely considerably more if you accounted for the water rights that went with the eastern acreage. "No," she said. Lynch smiled the way men smile when they have decided to be patient. "Think on it," he said. "Winter is coming. Running this place alone is not sustainable, Mrs. Atwood. Think on it." He rode away with his 2 men, and Kate stood on the porch until they were gone, and then she went inside and sat down at her kitchen table and pressed her hands flat against the wood and breathed slowly until the anger settled enough for her to think clearly. She wrote a letter to the lawyer in the county seat, a man named Aldrich Kane who had handled Thomas's estate, and who she trusted as much as she trusted anyone in that capacity, and she sent it with the next day's stage rider. Then she went back to work, because the land did not care about Garrett Lynch, and it needed what it needed regardless. The next morning, the 5th week of mornings, she was at the fence line when she heard the hooves, and this time something was different. The rhythm slowed earlier than usual, slowed and slowed again, and this time it did not resume, and when she turned, the man on the dark bay horse had stopped. He was 20 feet away on the other side of the fence, sitting his horse with that same easy posture she had observed every morning, and now that he was stopped and close enough to see properly, she discovered that he was perhaps 28 or 29 years old, with dark hair under the battered hat, dark eyes that were currently regarding her with an expression she could not quite categorize, and the kind of face that is not conventionally handsome so much as it is compelling. The kind you look at and feel the need to continue looking at. He did not say anything, neither did she. The bay horse dropped its head and blew a long breath through its nose and began cropping at the short autumn grass on the trail's edge. "Good morning," Kate said finally, because somebody had to. "Morning," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected and unhurried. Another silence. "You ride past here every morning," Kate said. "I do," he agreed. "Where are you going?" "South fence line," he said. "Broken M 3 miles down. I check it every morning before the rest of the day starts." "That is a long ride for a fence check," she said. Something that might have been a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. "I like the early morning," he said, "before the world gets loud." Kate considered him. He considered her. The bay horse found something it liked in the grass and set to it with intention. "I am Kate Atwood," she said. He touched the brim of his hat. "Dexter Merritt," he said. "I apologize for not stopping sooner. I have been meaning to introduce myself for some weeks now." "Some weeks," Kate repeated. 6 weeks approximately," he said, and there was a quality in his voice that suggested he was aware of exactly how that sounded. 6 weeks, she said. "I am not always quick about things," he said, still with that barely there almost smile. "No," she agreed, and found that she was smiling herself, which surprised her because she had not been doing much of that lately. "Well, now you have introduced yourself." "Now I have," he said. He sat there a moment longer, and she stood there, and the morning light lay across the dry grass in long golden bars, and then he said, "Your south fence line, the one that borders Prout's old place. It has a section down near the oak grove that needs attention. I noticed it a few mornings ago." Kate blinked. "You noticed my fence? Hard not to notice," he said. "The post is rotted at the base. One good push and anything could get through." "I will look at it," she said. "There is also," he said, and now he seemed to be choosing his words with some care. "The matter of Gerald Pruitt's land selling to the Colby County Land Trust. I heard about it yesterday in town. You are now bordering them on the east side." The warmth that had been growing in Kate's chest cooled slightly, replaced by the familiar weight of worry. "I am aware," she said. "A man named Lynch came to see me." Something shifted in Dexter Merritt's expression. Not anger exactly, but a kind of settling, the way a man looks when he receives information that confirms something he already suspected and does not like. "Lynch," he said. "He offered to buy you out." "He did. Did he threaten you?" "Not directly," Kate said. "He was very polite about it." "Men like Lynch are always very polite the first time," Dexter said. He seemed about to say more, then stopped himself. He adjusted the reins in his hands, and the bay horse raised its head and chewed thoughtfully. "Mrs. Atwood," he said, "if there is anything the Broken M can do, in terms of help with that fence or anything else, I would ask you to let us know." Kate looked at him. It was not an empty offer, she could tell that much. There was nothing performative about the way he said it, no flourish or exaggeration. He said it the way he seemed to do most things, directly and without decoration. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate that." He nodded, touched his hat again, and started the bay horse back into its walking rhythm. She watched him go, watched until the cottonwood trees took him, and then stood in the October morning with her hands in her coat pockets, and felt the warm thing return to her chest, larger now and more complicated than it had been before. She checked her south fence that afternoon and found the rotted post exactly where he had said it would be. She replaced it herself, digging out the old one with a bar and a good deal of effort, setting the new post with tamped earth and a rock she found nearby. And when she was finished, she stood and looked at the fence line and thought about the fact that a man she had not met had been paying enough attention to notice her fence needed work. 2 days passed. On the third day, Dexter Merritt came up the trail and stopped at her fence line without her being there to meet him. She saw him from the kitchen window and went out to the porch, and he pulled his horse up when he saw her and came along the trail to the gate. "I wanted to ask," he said, "if you would be willing to have supper with my family at the Broken M on Saturday. My mother cooks for the whole crew on Saturdays, and she is particular about it being a real supper and not just a bunkhouse meal. There is always room for a neighbor." Kate stood on the porch and absorbed this invitation. She was aware that it was simultaneously a social courtesy, a way of extending the connection that had been made, and also possibly a strategic alignment of some kind. The Broken M was the largest outfit in this part of the county, and having them as explicit allies would be meaningful in any conflict with the land trust. She was also aware that she wanted to go, independently of all of that, because of the man sitting on the bay horse in her yard. "I would like that," she said. He looked quietly pleased in the understated way she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. "Saturday, then. Come around 3 and the meal is at 5. He started to go, then turned back. "Bring anything you want for yourself," he said. "My mother will insist you leave with more than you came with, but she will be less fierce about it if you contribute something." "I make a very respectable pie," Kate said. "Then bring a pie," he said, and this time the smile was visible, clear and sudden and transforming, and Kate stood on her porch and watched him ride away and thought, well. She made an apple pie on Saturday morning, using the last of the good apples she had stored from the small orchard behind the house, and she drove her wagon down the main road, and then south along the ranch road that led to the Broken M, arriving shortly before 3 to find a compound that was larger and better ordered than she had imagined, with a solid 2-story house, a substantial barn, corrals with good horses, and a bunkhouse from which came the sound of men's voices and occasional laughter. A woman came out of the house before Kate had even tied the horse. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, compact and direct in the way that Willa Foss was, with dark hair that was going silver and eyes that were the same dark color as her son's, and she said, "You must be Mrs. Atwood. Dexter told us you would be coming. I am Dexter Merritt, and I am very glad you are here. What have you got there? Is that a pie? Come in, come in." It was the kind of welcome that makes a person feel as if they have been expected for a long time and have only just arrived. Dexter Merritt was a force of nature contained in a practical dress, and she ran the house and a great deal else at the Broken M with the efficient warmth of a woman who had built something worthwhile from the ground up and knew exactly what it was worth. Kate liked her immediately and without reservation. She met Robert Merritt, Dexter's father, who was a weathered man of perhaps 60 with a quiet manner and a firm handshake, and who seemed to have evaluated her in the first 30 seconds and reached a verdict he did not feel the need to announce. She met Dexter's younger brother Cal, who was 23 and full of energy and opinions about cattle prices, and Cal's wife Nora, who was 22 and expecting their first child in February, and who had, within 10 minutes of meeting Kate, begun discussing the logistics of childbirth in Colby County, with the frank practicality of someone who has decided that certain subjects are too important for false modesty. Dexter arrived from the South Range at 4:30, still dusty from the day's work, and when he came into the kitchen and saw Kate at the table with his mother and sister-in-law, something in his face shifted in a way that Kate noticed and carefully did not react to. "You made it," he said, as if there had been some doubt. "I said I would," Kate replied. "She brought a magnificent pie," Dexter announced. "I told her to bring a pie," Dexter said. "Yes, and it was good advice," Dexter said. "Now go wash the dust off and come back to the table." The meal was everything Dexter had promised and more. There were 7 people at the table, including 2 of the senior hands who ate in the house on Saturdays, and the conversation was the kind that happens when people are comfortable with each other and have enough genuine material to discuss. Cattle prices and weather patterns and the state of the water situation in the county, and the upcoming election for county commissioner, and the general philosophical question of whether the railroad extension that everyone said was coming would actually come or whether it was, as Cal maintained, the most optimistic collective delusion since anyone had believed in the California gold rush. Kate found herself talking more than she had talked at a single sitting in months. She found herself laughing at things Cal said, which were genuinely funny, and being asked real questions about her farm and her plans for it, and answering those questions without the defensive guardedness she usually carried in public, because the people asking them seemed to actually want to know. Dexter sat across from her and said relatively little, which she was coming to understand was his way. But he listened with complete attention, and when he did speak, it was precise and thoughtful and occasionally very dry in a way that made her laugh unexpectedly. He refilled her water glass without being asked. When she declined seconds of the cornbread, he passed the dish toward her again a few minutes later with no comment, and she took a piece, which she had wanted to do the first time but had been trying to appear more self-contained than she felt. She drove home in the early dark with a full stomach and a jar of Dexter's preserved beans that she had not been allowed to leave without, and she sat in her wagon under the wide black Texas sky with its extravagant stars and felt, for the first time in 14 months, something that she was almost afraid to look at directly. The next morning, Sunday, she did not go to church because the distance was long and she had gone twice in a row and allowed herself one skip, and she worked in the morning, and in the afternoon sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and looked at the eastern fence line and thought about Dexter Merritt. He came on Monday morning the same as always, and this time he stopped without any preamble and leaned on his saddle horn and said, "My mother wants to know if you will come again next Saturday." "Does your mother?" Kate said. "She does," Dexter said. "She also instructed me to ask if you needed anything in town this week because Cal is going in on Wednesday and could carry a list." "That is very kind," Kate said. "I do have a letter I need to send to my lawyer if Cal is going near the post office." "He will go near the post office," Dexter said. "I will have him stop here Tuesday evening to collect it." He started to move the horse along and Kate said, "Dexter." It was the first time she had used his given name and they both registered it. He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for Saturday. Your family is wonderful." He looked at her for a moment. "You fit in well," he said. "My mother would have told me if you did not." "Does she always tell you things like that?" "She tells me most things," he said. "She told me, for instance, that I should have stopped to introduce myself considerably sooner than I did. She knew you were riding past without stopping." "She knew," he said, and there was a rueful quality to the admission that made Kate press her lips together to contain her smile. "She sounds very wise," Kate said. "She is extraordinarily wise," Dexter said. "I try to keep that in mind." He rode on, and Kate stood at the fence and let the smile happen. Cal came by Tuesday evening and collected her letter to Aldrich Kane, and reported that Aliner had already decided Kate was good people, and that his mother's character assessments had a historical accuracy rate he estimated at 97%. Cal Merritt was the kind of young man who said whatever he thought with a confidence that was so genuine it never quite crossed into arrogance, and Kate enjoyed him enormously. But she also noted that, when he spoke of the land trust and Garrett Lynch, the lightness went out of his voice. "Lynch got the Palmer place 2 years ago," Cal said, sitting on her porch steps with his hat on his knee. "Sold them out from under the family, basically. The Palmer widow got a quarter of what it was worth, same pattern. He offered me $320, Kate said. Cal's expression said everything. "What is the farm worth?" "At minimum 800, Kate said. "Realistically closer to 1,000, maybe more if the water rights are valued properly." "He will come back," Cal said, "and the second offer will not be as polite." "I know," Kate said. "Dexter said to tell you," Cal said carefully, looking at his hat, "that if you wanted to talk through the legal situation, he would be glad to sit down with you and go over what you know. He used to handle some of the Broken M's land paperwork before we got big enough to have the lawyer do it full time. He knows how these land trust arrangements work." "Tell Dexter," Kate said, "that I would appreciate that." Cal nodded and stood and settled his hat. "Come Saturday again," he said. "Nora likes you. It is good for her to have someone else to talk to besides me, and I love her, but I apparently ask too many practical questions and not enough emotional ones, according to her, so you would be doing us both a favor." Kate laughed. "Saturday," she said. Dexter came on Saturday morning instead of his usual evening arrival, appearing at her gate at 10 in the morning with a rolled newspaper tucked under his arm and the kind of expression that suggested he had thought about this visit and was now committed to it. "I thought we could talk through the legal situation before we go to the house," he said. "I brought the county land registry notices from last week's paper." They sat at her kitchen table and spread the newspaper and Kate's own documents across the worn wood and spent 2 hours going through it. And Kate learned that Dexter Merritt was not merely handy with a fence line and a horse. He had a methodical, thorough mind that moved through legal and financial documents with a careful competence that she found deeply reassuring. He identified 3 things in the land trust's filing that Aldrich Kane should specifically challenge, and he wrote them out in a clear hand on a piece of paper she could send with her next letter. He also told her what he knew about the land trust's pattern of operation, which was what Cal had outlined and more. They targeted isolated landholders, particularly widows and families without male heirs who might be more susceptible to pressure. They operated within the letter of the law while violating everything behind it. They had the backing of at least 2 county officials who could make life difficult in various administrative ways. "The water rights are your strongest protection," Dexter said. "Your Eastern Creek is the only reliable water source for those 400 acres Prout sold. If the land trust cannot access that water, those acres are worth about 1/3 of what they paid for them. Lynch knows that. That is why he wants your land." "Can they take the water rights separately?" Kate asked. "Not without a legal fight," Dexter said, "and not if you have it clearly documented, which is what Kane needs to file." "You know a great deal about this," Kate said. "My father spent 4 years fighting a similar situation with the railroad," Dexter said. "We learned from it." Kate looked at him across the table. He was looking at the documents, his dark head bent slightly, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table and across his hands, which were large and careful and calloused in the particular way of someone who works with them constantly. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. He looked up. "You do not know me," she said. "Not really. We have spoken perhaps a handful of times. You owe me nothing." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for an answer, but the quiet of someone deciding how much of a true one to give. "You are a neighbor who is being treated unjustly," he said. "That would be reason enough." "But," Kate said, because she could hear the word in the pause. "But," he said, "I have also been riding past your farm every morning for 6 weeks, and in that time I have watched you work this land alone with a consistency and a determination that most men I know could not match. I have seen you out in the cold before sunrise fixing things, caring for things, holding things together. That kind of person deserves to keep what they have built." Kate was quiet, holding the warmth of what he had said carefully, the way you hold something fragile. "You watched me for 6 weeks before you stopped," she said. "I did," he admitted. "Why did you wait so long?" He looked at her with those dark eyes, and for the first time she saw in them something unguarded, something that had perhaps been there every morning on the trail and that she had simply not been close enough to see. "Because I was not sure what I would do once I stopped," he said. Kate held his gaze and did not look away. Outside, a crow landed on the fence post and announced itself and flew off again. The morning was moving around them. "Well," she said finally. "You have stopped now." "I have," he said. They drove to the Broken M together in his wagon, and Dexter Merritt, watching them come up the road from the kitchen window, turned to her husband and said nothing. But the look she gave him contained a full conversation's worth of information. And Robert Merritt smiled into his coffee cup and also said nothing, because some things do not need to be spoken aloud. Over the following weeks, the shape of things changed. Dexter continued to ride past the farm every morning on his way to the south fence, but he stopped now, consistently, and sometimes the stop was brief, just a few minutes of conversation while the bay horse waited patiently, and sometimes it was longer. He helped her replace 2 sections of fence that had been in poor condition. She fed him coffee on cold mornings, the good coffee she kept for occasions rather than the everyday kind. He brought her a copy of the county land regulations that he had obtained from the courthouse, and she gave him a jar of apple preserves, and neither of them acknowledged that these exchanges were anything other than practical, which was part of what made them so clearly something else. The letter from Aldrich Kane arrived in early November, and it was encouraging. Kane had reviewed the land trust's filing and the points Dexter had identified, and he believed a formal challenge to the water rights claim could be filed and would have a reasonable chance of success. He recommended acting quickly, before the trust could move to establish any administrative precedent. Kate wrote back immediately authorizing the challenge and enclosing the fee from her carefully managed savings, which was enough to cover it without leaving her in a dangerous position, though not without some cost. She told Dexter about it on a Tuesday morning at the fence, and he listened with the attention he always gave her, and when she was finished he said, "Good. Kane is the right man and those are the right arguments. You should hear back within 6 weeks. And in the meantime," Kate said. "In the meantime," Dexter said, "keep doing what you are doing. Document everything Lynch does or says. If he comes back, have a witness if you can." "He came yesterday," Kate said. She had not told him yet because she was still processing it herself. Dexter's hands tightened on the reins briefly. "What did he say?" "He raised the offer to $400, Kate said. "He was still polite. But he mentioned very carefully that last winter had been unusually hard on farms in the area and that some had not recovered and that it was a shame to see a property go to waste." "He threatened you," Dexter said. "He strongly implied," Kate said. "Which I think he considers a meaningful distinction." The set of Dexter's jaw was something she had not seen before, and it told her things about him that the easy mornings had not revealed. He was not a man who became loud or dramatic about things that made him angry, but the anger was there, controlled and absolute, and she thought that if Garrett Lynch understood the man sitting on this horse, he would choose his implications more carefully. "If he comes again," Dexter said, "send word to the Broken M someone will come." "I am not helpless," Kate said with enough precision that he heard it clearly. "I know that," he said immediately. "I am not suggesting otherwise. I am suggesting that a witness and a visible neighbor are useful in these situations, which is true regardless of whether the person being witnessed is helpless or not." Kate looked at him. "You are right," she said. "I know that. I am sorry. I am tired of needing to fight for what is already mine." "You are not wrong to be tired of it," he said, and his voice had lost the controlled edge entirely, replaced by something gentler that she was beginning to know as his truest register. "You are not wrong to be angry about it either. The situation is unjust. You should not have to navigate it at all." Kate looked at the dry November grass along the fence and the pale sky above the eastern ridge and felt the anger and the tiredness in her chest alongside something else, something that the morning and this man and the steady presence of him across the fence kept shifting in a direction she had been trying with diminishing success to be rational about. "Dexter," she said. "Yes," he said. "Would you like to come in for coffee this morning? Not at the fence. Come in." The pause was only a breath long. "Yes," he said. "I would." He tied the bay horse at the post and came through the gate, and she walked beside him up the path to the house, and he stepped inside and took his hat off as he ducked through the low doorframe, and she made coffee on the iron stove while he stood in her kitchen and looked at it with the careful, interested attention he gave to everything. "Thomas built this," she said, because she felt it needed to be said here in this room. "All of it. He was a very good carpenter." "He did good work," Dexter said, not quickly, giving the assessment the weight of honest observation. "He was a good man," Kate said. She handed Dexter his coffee and looked at him. "I want you to know that I am not over-grieving him. I think sometimes people assume when they see a widow who is functioning that she has recovered. But I loved him and I miss him and I carry that. I am just also still here." Dexter looked at her steadily. "I understand that," he said, "and I would not want you to be any way other than what you actually are." She sat down at the table, and he sat across from it, the same positions as when they had spread the documents there, and they drank their coffee and talked about nothing that was immediately urgent, about the winter that was coming and whether it would be as hard as last year's, and about Aliner's plan to expand the kitchen garden in the spring, and about a book Kate had been reading, one of the few she had brought with her from Missouri. And Dexter said he had not read that particular author, but that his mother had several books she might enjoy, and Kate said she would be glad to borrow them. And the morning moved around them, and the coffee was good, and the conversation was easy, and neither of them mentioned what was actually happening, which was that two people were discovering that being in the same room together was better than either of them had expected, and neither of them had words for it yet that felt adequate. He left at 9:30, putting his hat back on at the door, and turned to look at her. "Mrs. Atwood," he said. "Kate," she said, "please." He took that in. "Kate," he said, and the two-syllable word in his voice was, she thought, one of the finest things she had heard in a very long time. "I will see you tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow morning," she agreed. He left, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him ride out, and then she went and stood at the kitchen window the way she had that first morning so many weeks ago, and she thought that something was beginning and that it frightened her, and that she was going to let it anyway. The winter settled in hard in December, which in Colby County, Texas, meant temperatures that dropped below freezing most nights and occasional sleet, and the kind of wind that came off the flat land to the north without any obstacle to slow it down. Kate had laid in her firewood and her stores, and she had the 2 horses and the chickens and the root vegetables in the cellar, and she managed. Dexter came past every morning still, though in December there were some mornings when the trail was icy and the bay horse moved more carefully. On those mornings Kate worried, which surprised her by its intensity. She watched from the window and breathed easier when she saw him pass, going and coming back, safe and steady. The Saturday suppers continued. Dexter Merritt had adopted Kate Atwood into her sphere of concern, with the decisive thoroughness of a woman who does not make such decisions lightly, and does not unmake them once made. Cal and Nora Merritt grew into a kind of comfortable extended family that Kate had not expected to find in Texas, in the county where she had come to be a wife and had become, instead, a widow, and then something she was still in the process of defining. Nora's baby came in February, a boy they named James Robert Merritt, and he was born on a Wednesday night in a fierce cold snap that had the whole ranch on edge. And Kate came when the message arrived because Dexter asked her to come, and because Nora had, in the months of their friendship, become someone Kate would go anywhere for. She sat with Nora through the long hours and held her hand when holding was needed and went for things when fetching was needed. And the baby arrived in the small hours of the morning, healthy and loud and perfect. And when Kate finally came out of the room and found Dexter sitting in the kitchen because he had been there all night too, neither of them knowing quite why except that this was where they needed to be, he looked up at her and she said, "A boy, James Robert. Everyone is fine." And he put his face in his hands for a moment in a way that told her more about him than most long conversations could have. And then he looked up again and said, "Good. That is good." And she sat down across from him at the kitchen table, and they drank the cold coffee that was all that was left, and they did not say much, and it was one of the most companionable hours she had ever spent with another person. In March, the letter came from Aldrich Kane. It was good news, nearly entirely. The legal challenge to the land trust's claim on the water rights had been sustained by the county judge. The land trust could not access the Eastern Creek without Kate's explicit agreement, and Kane had further managed to establish on record that any acquisition of Kate's property would require a separate and independent valuation, which effectively eliminated Lynch's ability to lowball her. The land trust had, Kane reported, decided to redirect its interest elsewhere, toward a parcel on the county's western edge where there was less legal complication. Kate read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table before she allowed herself to believe it. Then she went out to the porch and stood in the March air, which was cold still but carrying in it the first soft smell of approaching spring, and she felt the ground under her feet her ground, and she breathed. She told Dexter the next morning at the fence, and she watched his face as he took in the information, and what she saw there was a relief so genuine and so unguarded that it moved her considerably. "That is the best news I have heard in months," he said. "It is the best news I have had since I cannot remember when," Kate said. He looked at her. The March morning was bright and cold, the sky that particular clear blue that comes after a hard winter, and she was standing at the fence in her coat with her hair not entirely properly organized. Yet, because she had rushed out when she heard him coming, wanting to tell him immediately, and he was looking at her with the dark eyes that she had spent months learning to read, and what she read in them now was something she could not be uncertain about. "Kate," he said, and she heard the same quality in her name that she had heard that first time he said it, except deeper now, like something that had been building weight for a long time. "Yes," she said, because she had learned that with this man, a simple yes covered a great deal of territory and he knew what to do with it. He dismounted. He dropped the reins over the fence post with the ease of long habit, and he came through the gate, and he walked to where she was standing, and he stopped close enough that she could see the details of his face that she had spent 6 weeks learning from a distance, and the subsequent months learning up close, the lines at the corners of his eyes and the scar on his chin from some old encounter he had mentioned once in passing, and the way his mouth had a particular shape when he was thinking something he had not yet said. "I have been thinking about what to say to you," he said. "How long?" she asked. "Since approximately the first morning I rode past your fence," he said, with such absolute seriousness that she almost laughed except that she was too full of something else to find room for laughter just then. "Then say it," she said quietly. He reached out and took her hand, the one that was hanging at her side, and held it with both of his, the same careful way he held everything. "I love you," he said. I am not a man who says things he does not mean, and I am not saying this quickly or lightly. I have loved you for some time. I want, if you are willing, to be with you. To stay in your life in a way that is real and permanent, if that is something you want. Kate looked at him and at their joined hands and at the farm stretching behind her, her farm, the one she had fought for and held onto, and that was hers. And she thought about Thomas, who would always be carried with her, and she thought about 14 months of aloneness, and the morning she had first heard hoofbeats and looked up. She thought about coffee at the kitchen table and a letter about water rights and a newborn named James Robert, and all the mornings, of a dark horse moving through the golden early light. I love you too, she said. I think I have for some time also. He brought her hand up and held it against his chest and looked at her, and she moved closer and he put his other arm around her, and the March morning was bright around them, and the farm was there, and the sky was clear. And for the first time in 14 months Kate Atwood did not feel the weight of everything as a thing to be managed alone. Is this permanent enough? She said into his coat. Or should we talk about what permanent means? She felt him laugh, which was something she had not yet experienced at close range, and it was very good. We should talk about what permanent means, he said, but not this minute. No, she agreed, not this minute. They stood there in the March morning for a while longer, and then he kissed her, which was not something either of them had done yet, and it was the kind of first kiss that has a long history in it, that carries all the mornings and the fence-line conversations and the kitchen table and the carefully spoken truths, and when they stepped apart they were both somewhat breathless in a way that the cold air alone did not explain. I should go check my fence line, he said. You should, she agreed. I will come back this evening, he said. I know you will, she said. He went through the gate and mounted the bay horse and looked back at her once, and the look was the kind that does not need any words to annotate it, and then he rode south in the March morning, and Kate stood at her fence and watched him go, and she was smiling, and the farm was around her, and the sky was enormous, and the spring was coming. He came back that evening, as promised, and they sat on the porch in the cold together and talked properly about what permanent meant. Dexter said it meant marriage if she would have it, and he said it without flourish or performance, just with the direct simplicity that was his way. He said he was not asking her to leave her farm. He said he was asking if she was willing to figure out how 2 pieces of land and 2 people might be made into one life, and that there were probably practical arrangements to be worked out, but that the practical arrangements could be worked out if the central question was answered. Kate said the central question was answered. He stayed for supper, and they talked about the practical arrangements, which were considerable but not insurmountable. The Broken M was 3 miles south. The Atwood farm could not be left entirely unattended. They discussed the possibility of hiring a reliable hand for the farm, someone who could manage the daily operations while Kate oversaw the whole, which was different from running it entirely alone. Dexter said he would continue to ride past every morning on his way to the south fence line because he always had, and it was a good route. Although, he said, the reason for the route may now be more obvious. I think, Kate said, your mother already understood the reason. My mother, Dexter said, understood the reason before I did. They told Dexter Merritt the next Saturday, and Dexter looked at them both across the kitchen table and said, finally, with such profound relief that Cal choked on his coffee and Nora laughed so hard that baby James, who was being held in her arms, startled and began to complain. I told you, Dexter said to Robert. 6 weeks that boy rode past that fence without stopping. 6 weeks. You did tell me, Robert agreed. Months ago I told you. I know. And now here we are, Dexter said, and she looked at Kate with the warm, direct regard that Kate had come to know was Dexter Merritt's way of saying important things without being sentimental about them. I am very glad you are going to be family, she said. So am I, Kate said, and meant it in ways she could not have entirely predicted when she had arrived at that table for the first time in October. They were married in April, when the county had fully turned its face toward spring and the live oaks were putting out their new leaves, and the creek on the eastern edge of Kate's land was running bright and clear, because it was her water and it would remain so. The ceremony was in the same small clapboard church Kate had been attending on Sunday mornings, performed by Pastor Whitfield, who had been in the county so long that he had a kind of historical authority about him, and attended by most of the people Kate and Dexter knew, which turned out to be more than Kate had realized she knew. Willa Foss sat in the front row and cried enthusiastically, and was not remotely embarrassed about it. Cal and Nora came with baby James, who slept through the entire service in the sturdy basket Nora had brought for the purpose. Alina sat beside Robert and held his hand, and looked at her eldest son with an expression that was private and complete. Kate wore a dress she had made over the winter months, a blue-gray wool that caught the light, and she carried a few early wildflowers that she had gathered that morning from the edge of the east pasture, and she walked down the short aisle of the clapboard church to where Dexter was standing, waiting, in the good jacket he had pressed for the occasion, and he looked at her with the same unguarded expression she had first seen in his face that March morning at the fence, and she thought that if she lived to be very old, she would still be able to close her eyes and see this exact moment. Pastor Whitfield said the words. They said their own words back, the promises that people have made to each other in wild places, and settled ones for as long as there have been people. And when Dexter put the ring on her finger, the ring that had been his grandmother's and that Alina had pressed into his hand the previous evening with a look that precluded any discussion, Kate felt the weight of it as something that added rather than constrained. They had their celebration at the Broken M, of course, because Alina had been planning it since before anyone had given her formal permission to. And it was the kind of gathering that generates its own warmth in the way that celebrations do when the people in them are genuinely glad. Aldrich Kane came and shook Dexter's hand and congratulated Kate on the legal victory as much as the matrimony, which she appreciated as an accurate accounting of two separate achievements. Willa Foss ate 3 pieces of the wedding cake Alina had made and declared it the finest event in the county, since the railroad finally ran through the southern edge 2 years previous. The Broken M hands, who had become over the months of Kate's Saturday visit something close to a peripheral family, made enough noise in the celebration to startle the horses in the far corral, which was generally agreed to be the correct level of enthusiasm. Dexter danced with her, which she had not known he could do until that evening, and he was not precisely graceful, but he was careful and he held her properly, and he looked at her through the music with that particular expression she had claimed for herself, and she was very happy. They built their life across the 2 properties in the way they had discussed, with a practical thoroughness that satisfied both of them. A hand named Joseph Tanner, who was 35 and reliable, and had worked range cattle all his adult life, came to manage the Atwood farm's day-to-day operations, answering to Kate, who kept her ownership clear and her oversight active. Dexter continued to ride the south fence every morning, but the route now included a stop at the farmhouse that was no longer described as a brief conversation at the fence. By summer, Kate had begun spending her weekday mornings at the farm and her weekends at the Broken M, a division that suited the needs of both properties and both people. By autumn, the division had become more fluid, because life in practice does not organize itself according to tidy weekly schedules, and what emerged instead was something more organic and more satisfying, 2 places that were both genuinely theirs, a larger life than either had had before. The Atwood farm prospered in a way it had not been able to under the strain of Kate's sole management. With Joseph Tanner's reliable labor and the occasional help from Broken M hands when it was needed, and Kate's own consistent oversight, the land was worked properly for the first time since Thomas's death. She increased the chicken operation, which generated steady income, and in the spring she planted a larger kitchen garden than she had managed before, and in her second autumn as Kate Merritt, she hired a second-hand part-time for the harvest season and turned a profit that she recorded in the ledger with a satisfaction that was almost physical. The land trust had, as Kane had reported, moved on. Garrett Lynch appeared in the county occasionally on other business, and when Kate encountered him, as she did once at the general store in town in the late summer of that first married year, he was very polite and spoke as if the previous winter's conversation had never happened, which was a form of erasure she found both irritating and satisfying, because it meant he knew he had lost. She told Dexter about the encounter that evening, and he listened with his arms crossed and an expression that was carefully neutral. "Was he troublesome?" he asked. "No," Kate said. "He was perfectly polite." "Good," Dexter said. "I handled it perfectly well on my own," Kate said, because she still believed in saying this when it was true. "I know you did," Dexter said, without any qualification, and she kissed him for it. Willa Foss came for dinner every few weeks, and each time she and Dexter engaged in a conversation that operated partly as a warm test of each other's knowledge and partly as genuine mutual regard, and Kate watched them from across the table and felt the specific contentment of seeing people she loved being easy with each other. Alina continued to be Alina, which was a constant and a blessing. She taught Kate several things that first winter, including how to make a specific kind of preserves that required a particular timing and a good deal of attention, and a method for waterproofing boots that Dexter said was the most useful knowledge transferable between generations, and how to read the weather in Colby County by the specific behaviors of certain birds in the trees along the north side of the house, which was not scientifically verifiable but was, in practice, remarkably accurate. The following spring, Kate was sitting on the porch of the Broken M with Alina, both of them shelling peas in the morning sun, when she told her mother-in-law that she was expecting. Alina set down her bowl of peas and looked at Kate with an expression that did several things in very rapid succession, and then she said, "Does Dexter know?" "Not yet," Kate said. "I wanted to tell you first." Alina was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that Kate looked at her with some attention. Alina's eyes were bright in a way that was not quite dry. "Thank you," Alina said. She reached over and put her hand on Kate's hand and held it for a moment and said nothing else, and Kate understood that the gratitude was not only about being told first. Kate told Dexter that evening, sitting with him on the porch of the farmhouse, the same porch where they had talked about permanent things on a March night that felt simultaneously very recent and a long time ago. She told him straight, in the direct way she had come to prefer for important things, and she watched his face. He was very still for a long moment. Then he turned to look at her, and she saw his eyes were bright, and he said, "Kate," and then stopped. "I know," she said. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling extremely well," she said, also somewhat terrified, but that is separate from the physical question. "That is reasonable," he said. He took her hand. "We will figure out everything that needs figuring out. You will not do this alone." "I know I will not," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to it, which was not something he did often and which therefore meant considerably more when he did. "I love you," he said. "I know that too," she said. "I love you." They sat on the porch in the spring evening with the light going golden over the east pasture, and the farm was around them. Kate's farm, her ground, and the creek ran somewhere in the distance, and the horses moved in the near pasture, and the chickens had put themselves to bed in their small house, and the spring was fully arrived, and everything that had been fought for was held. Nora Merritt was a magnificent source of practical information about pregnancy in Colby County, Texas, having navigated it herself very recently, and with a characteristic refusal to spare either herself or anyone asking about it the full, unvarnished reality. She told Kate what to eat and what not to eat and who the best doctor in the county was, which was Dr. Eliza Harp in the county seat, one of the very few women physicians in the territory, who had been practicing for 11 years and who was, according to Nora, worth the longer drive. Kate began seeing Dr. Harp monthly and found her to be exactly as Nora had described, thorough and intelligent, and entirely without the condescension that Kate had encountered from male physicians on the rare occasions she had needed to see one. Dr. Harp was 50, had come to Texas from Ohio 20 years earlier when the territory was still considerably wilder than it was now, and had built her practice through a combination of competence and stubbornness that Kate admired in the same way she admired Eleanor. The summer moved through in the long golden way of Texas summers, hot and insistent, and Kate worked the farm at a somewhat modified pace that she negotiated with herself carefully, maintaining her oversight and her presence while allowing Joseph Tanner to carry more of the physical labor. Dexter was attentive in the particular way he had of being attentive, which was not fussing, but rather a constant quiet awareness of her situation that manifested in small, concrete things. He repaired the step at the farmhouse that had been slightly loose for months. He added a rail to the porch. He came home with a second rocking chair that he set beside the first one on the broken M porch without comment, and Kate looked at the two chairs side by side and felt something in her chest that she suspected was the most straightforward kind of happiness. Cal and Nora were delighted in the loud, uncontained way that characterized Cal Merritt's engagement with most things that pleased him. Baby James was nearly 6 months old now, and had begun to express opinions about the world around him with considerable volume, and Cal declared that James would be a perfectly adequate older cousin, and that he had his mother's even temperament and his father's complete inability to be quiet about things, and Nora said this was entirely inaccurate on both counts. And the conversation devolved from there, in the way that conversations involving Cal Merritt generally did. And Kate sat on the broken M porch in the summer evening, with her hands folded over the beginning of her future, and laughed, until she was somewhat out of breath. The baby was born in October, as the cottonwoods along the East Trail went yellow again and the mornings grew sharp. A full year since the first Saturday supper at the broken M. A year and some months since a morning when Kate had looked up from a reluctant pump handle and first heard hoofbeats on the trail. They had a boy. They named him Thomas Dexter Merritt, Thomas for the man who had built the farmhouse and loved Kate well and was carried with her always, and Dexter for his father, and both names felt correct in the way that true things do. He was born in the early morning at the farmhouse, with Dr. Harp in attendance and Eleanor there and Dexter there. And when the first sounds the baby made in the world filled the room, Dexter was holding Kate's hand, and he did not let go of it for a very long time after. She held the baby in the morning light and looked at him, and thought about everything that had brought her to this room, from Missouri to Texas to this farm to this morning. And she thought about Thomas Atwood, who had built the room around her, and who she missed with a grief that was quieter now than it had been, transformed by time into something she carried rather than something that carried her. And she thought about Dexter beside her, and Eleanor in the chair by the window, and the farm outside, and all the mornings of the trail. "Hello," she said to her son very quietly. "I have been waiting for you." He had dark eyes, unmistakably his father's. He regarded her with the ancient, unfocused seriousness of newborns and seemed to be reserving judgment. Dexter leaned over and looked at his son with an expression Kate knew she would remember for the rest of her life, and he said, "He looks very serious." "He does," Kate agreed. "He will come around," Dexter said. The autumn moved forward. The farm was stacked with its harvest and ready for winter. Joseph Tanner had the operation running smoothly, and Kate had managed the season's accounts with the precision she brought to everything. And the ledger showed a second consecutive year of profit, modest but real, the kind that compounds over time into something substantial. She came to the fence line less often now, for obvious reasons, though she was out in the mornings when she could be. And Dexter still stopped, still every morning, a habit that had been established before they had words for it, and that had simply continued across all the changes in the nature of the stopping. One morning in late October, Kate was on the porch with Thomas on her shoulder, the baby being in one of his contemplative moods rather than his vocal ones, when she heard the familiar hoofbeats on the trail. She watched Dexter come around the cottonwood bend and slow as he always did and stop at the gate, and he looked at her on the porch and at the baby, and something in his face did the thing it always did when he looked at them, and she felt the thing it always made her feel, which was a kind of wholeness she had not known she was missing until she had it. "Good morning," she called. "Good morning," he called back. "The coffee is hot," she said. He dismounted and tied the bay horse at the gate and came up the path, the same path he had walked that first November morning when she had invited him inside. And he came up the porch steps and took the baby from her with the ease of a man who had been doing this daily for a month now. And Thomas looked up at his father with the serious dark eyes, and after a moment seemed to decide something was acceptable, and Dexter held him and looked at Kate. "He is going to be trouble," Dexter said. "In about 2 years. He is going to be magnificent," Kate said. "Both of those things," Dexter agreed. They went inside, and the coffee was hot, and the morning was moving in its steady way outside the windows, and the farm was going through its October business. And somewhere down the trail, the south fence line waited for its morning check, and the baby was passed between them across the kitchen table with the unconscious ease of two people who have learned each other thoroughly. And the house that Thomas Atwood had built with his own careful hands was full and warm. By the time Thomas Dexter Merritt was 2 years old, he was indeed trouble, but the magnificent kind. He had inherited his mother's determination and his father's thoroughness, applied them to everything in his immediate environment, and was managing to be simultaneously exhausting and the delight of every person who encountered him. Cal and Nora's son James, now 3, had appointed himself Thomas's senior advisor, a role he discharged with Cal's characteristic certainty and Nora's more practical instincts, and the two boys together were capable of achieving a level of creative chaos that Alina declared was entirely the fault of the previous generation, and declined to specify which previous generation she meant. Kate was expecting again, and was less terrified the second time, though not entirely without the feeling, because she had learned that some feelings are not a sign of unpreparedness, but simply of taking a serious thing seriously. The farm had continued to grow in its careful way. 3 years of good management had brought the herd back up to a respectable size, not cattle on the scale of the Broken M, but a solid, sustainable operation that generated consistent income. The kitchen garden was extensive now, and the apple orchard that Thomas Atwood had planted was mature and producing well. Joseph Tanner had stayed on and showed no indication of leaving, having become in that way that reliable people sometimes do, the kind of presence that the place itself seemed to require. The Colby County Land Trust had never returned. Garrett Lynch had eventually moved his operations to another county entirely, which was someone else's problem and not Kate's. Aldrich Kane had retired the previous spring, handing his practice to a younger lawyer he had trained, and Kate had marked the end of his career with a letter of genuine gratitude that she had spent some time composing properly. The second baby came in the spring, a girl this time, healthy and opinionated from the first hour, and they named her Alina Margaret, Alina for the grandmother who had understood things before anyone else did, and who held her new granddaughter with the expression of someone receiving exactly what they had not allowed themselves to expect, and Margaret for Kate's own mother, gone these 8 years, but carried the same way Kate had learned to carry everyone she loved who had left. Robert Merritt, who had been quietly watching everything from his usual position of understated presence throughout all of this, held his granddaughter the afternoon of her birth and said, to no one in particular, "The county is in better shape than it was," and everyone understood that he was not talking about the infant. Dexter, standing beside Kate's bed that same afternoon, looked at his daughter and his wife with the complete attention he had always given the things that mattered most to him. And Kate looked back at him and thought about a morning 3 years ago when she had been on her knees in the dirt fighting a pump handle that did not want to work, and she had heard hoofbeats and looked up. She thought about the 6 weeks of mornings before those hoofbeats ever stopped, the 6 weeks of watching a man ride past and not knowing his name, and she thought about the particular kind of fate that operates not in dramatic gestures, but in the repetition of ordinary things, the same trail every morning, the same fence line, the same moment when finally, after 6 weeks, something changed. She thought about all the things that had happened in the space between that first morning and this one. The legal fight for the water rights, the kitchen table conversations, the Saturday suppers, the March morning at the fence when he had said "I love you" in the plain, direct way he did everything. The wedding in the clapboard church, Thomas being born, the ledger with 2 years of profit in it, the farm that was hers and also theirs. She thought about Thomas Atwood, who she still missed, who had built the walls around her life with such careful love, and whose name they had given their firstborn son as both an honoring and a continuation. "She looks like you," Dexter said, looking at the baby. "She looks like your mother," Kate said. "My mother looks like me," he said. Kate laughed, which made the baby startle and then subside again, returning to the profound sleep of new infants, and Dexter smiled. And outside the window the spring evening was moving in its golden, unhurried way, and the farm was there, and the creek was running clear on the eastern edge, and somewhere down the south trail the cottonwoods were green with new leaves, and Thomas Dexter Merritt, 2 years old and magnificent, was in the broken kitchen with a leaner who was teaching him the names of things with the patience and pleasure of a grandmother who has been waiting for exactly this. And everything that had been fought for was held, and everything that had been waited for had come. And the life that Kate Atwood had built, alone and then not alone, was full in every direction she could look. She reached for Dexter's hand, and he gave it, and they stayed like that in the quiet spring room while their daughter slept between them and the evening settled into night, and the stars came out over Colby County, Texas, the same as they did every night, extravagant and indifferent and beautiful, the same stars that had been there over every other night of this story, and over all the mornings at the fence, and over the first morning when she had looked up from the dirt and heard, coming from the direction of the cottonwood bend, the steady 4-beat sound of a horse that would, eventually, stop.